So won't do any bios because it just takes time. But thank you very much, Danny, Alex, and Matt, for giving the time and arranging it on three different time zones. It's always a challenge. And the 20 odd people that have joined us. We're going to kick off with Alex. The rise of isometrics. Just look up a little bit, Alex. Is that a Sportsmith t-shirt I see there? No? Is it sports?
Absolutely, mate. I'm the
Yeah.
Australian model.
Yes.
My invoice is in the mail.
Yes. Good man. Right, back to
Although I'm competing with JC there, aren't I?
yeah, you are. You absolutely are. Right, let's get to it. Sorry, got waylaid there. What is it about ISOs that means they're so attractive to 2024's practitioners?
There's probably a few reasons, Rob. I think the first one we can't deny is the shiny new toy aspect. Obviously, people see something shiny and new. Although isometrics historically has been around for a very, very long time, it's not mainstay education in strength and conditioning and sports science university degrees or vocational qualifications. So it's new and it's shiny, and so people get drawn to it, right? Which is not the best thing, but that's certainly one reason why probably today's world draws to these things quite quickly. The other thing is that it's we have the genuine practitioner out there who's inquisitive and wants to learn. And because, like I say, it's not in the mainstream education, now there's more information out there to really get into the depths of the science behind isometrics and how to apply it, the real nitty gritty. And from modern day practitioners who might just be writing textbooks, but actually are out there doing it in the real world and using it effectively. And so that's drawn another interest, obviously, from another group of hopefully more the majority of people. And then there's the practitioners who are already in the systems, applying it and or applying methods of training and seeking other solutions, wanting another answer, struggling, battling this balance between applying optimal stress to get adaptation and then being able to recover effectively and then perform. And that cyclical domain that we're constantly in, and then trying to find another solution to be able to do that potentially more optimally, or to avoid some negative consequences that inevitably we have in sport, because sport is a pretty brutal thing to the body. And then lastly, we have those who are implementing it, actually implementing isometrics. I think the first time you got me speaking about isometrics was way back in 2014 or 2015. Not that I was the creator of isometrics by any stretch, but certainly that enticed people to go out and start trying things, certainly getting in contact with me and others. And people have been applying it for 10 years, or more. And they're more interested in it. More questions come out. They might get to a bit of a roadblock and then want another answer on how to apply it or how to apply it differently. And when we look at isometrics, which you're clearly going to unpack today, isometrics, just like traditional strength training, there's so many different options, variables, and things to consider within a training program. So I think that's what's interesting. And then, of course, you can't deny the fact people like my esteemed colleagues here, Matt and Danny, and all the information they put out, the research that Danny's done over the last sort of 5 years now has really intrigued people into the hardcore scientific and training applications based on science too.
Yeah, I think just to allude to some of the points you raised there, Alex, I think especially at the elite level, I think what we're seeing as well, these demanding schedules where the being able to implement strength training, if we want to term it strength training as an overview term, is getting more and more challenging. Given like the being able to like prepare for competition and also recover in between. So I think obviously we have this wide spectrum of isometric training, whether it's the yielding type, overcoming type, if you want to use that type of terminology, of how those when we apply those training stimuluses to athletes, what is the consequence of that on the athlete? So I think understanding that is where we can actually program strength training or isometric strengthening training within your global program on a more frequent basis, to either whether it's overcoming to potentiate, prepare for competition, or whether that's more in touch, knowing like the dynamic side, the yielding type, and is linked with eccentric, where we can link that in as what away from competition per se, because we know it's potentially going to induce muscle soreness, etc. What comes with muscle soreness? How we can understand when we apply stimulus, the stress it's going to cause on the athlete and the implications of that, and how we can link that into with our programming especially when the Premier League now, especially look at it, teams are playing 2 games a week. The NBA teams are playing 5 games in 8 days. How we can embed strength training per se within these dense training periods. I think it's given us although it's like Alex alluded to, it's nothing new, isometric strength training, but I think the increase in research that has come out in the last 5 years, the increased knowledge that's been put out from a practical standpoint by Danny and Alex, it's made people more aware of, they have more options, they have more tools in the toolbox to program in between these dense periods.
Anything to add there, Danny? I'm just keen to get your angle particularly from, I know you're a practitioner at heart, but from a research perspective, how exciting could this area get with people like yourself and these are the 2 guys pushing it forwards?
I think that one of the things is that isometric can actually be easily performed out on the field as well. And things I've always told people is that nowadays there's a lot of microdosing research coming out, add some isometric training into part of the warm-up. And now recently there's some research coming out showing that isometric contraction can actually improve dynamic performance acutely. So we have that post-activation performance enhancement effect from isometric contraction. So I think and you can perform isometric work in any position. I think a lot of creative coaches they get their athletes into that sport-specific position, and then they perform the isometric movement, isometric action in those positions, and they found that it really transfer well to actual performance as well. So I think it's because of more information coming out, and people start to experiment it themselves, and they found it useful, and they start to spread the words.
We'll dive into the creating ISO positions that train positions found in sport a little bit later, Danny. But just sticking with you, and thank you to Matt and Alex for that as well. The article that you wrote for Sportsman on combining plyos and isometrics really caught people's attention. I know you've written stuff post then, which is still getting traction. Would you mind just giving us a bit of an overview of your thoughts on combining plyos and isometrics and how people may do it? And we'll get the insight of Matt and Alex as well on this.
Okay, so back to the theoretical side of things again. So I won't go too specific into which study showing which, but if you look into the literature, you can find that when we do ballistic action like plyometrics, sprinting, and stuff like that, the muscles actually get into isometric state so that it can stretch the tendon and allow the tendon to store elastic energy and then recoil, and we get that propulsive force, right? So essentially what happens is plyometric allows us to train the muscles to get into high active stiffness, meaning into an isometric state of contraction. But what happened is because it causes the tendon to stretch too quickly, it doesn't really strengthen, so it doesn't really cause the tendon to improve in tendon stiffness as much as resistance training. On the other hand, tendon respond well to high strain, but it needs high but slow strain, and that's why isometric training works well. You can produce high amount of force at the same time. You can produce that force slowly, and the best thing is you can repeatedly produce that high amount of force. Unlike Yeah, so you can do a maximum voluntary contraction multiple times within a session, but you can't actually do 1 RM lift more than one or twice, maybe. Yeah. So that's why isometric seems to be quite an ideal way to improve the tendon stiffness, right? So we know that plyometric is very good at improving the muscle stiffness, active muscle stiffness, and isometric training is good. Isometric training is good at improving the tendon stiffness. So we want to be able to have high muscle stiffness so that we can pull the tendon, and we want a tendon that's stiff so that when we pull it, it causes a greater recoil. So, and that's why I came up with this idea whereby if you combine the both of them together, it should theoretically be a very ideal method of training. And there were some studies, actually quite recent, within the last few years. 2 studies I've noticed that actually looked at using combining iso and plyometric training method, and they did show that it is in fact effective in improving ballistic movement like jumps. One study specifically looked at handball athletes, so they showed running throws and stuff like that improve in handball athletes. Yeah. So yeah. And how to go about it? Well, I wrote an ebook and Alex endorsed it. People can can check it out from my website.
What's the website, Danny?
So letter D, performanceconcept.com.
Perfect. Great. Just pulling the other guys in, and I'll go Alex first because he's in the left-hand side. Have you played around with this? How would you program it just to help those on the call kind of picture it and how they would pull it into a day or a week?
Yeah, look, really quickly, Rob, I complex them quite readily. That's my favorite way of doing them. Danny's saying, obviously do both. You could do them different sessions, whatever, as long as you're training and getting those adaptations. From a motor skill perspective, I often think about this as well. So, we're doing a stimulus like isometrics, clearly for the stiffness, like Danny's mentioned. We're doing muscle stiffness work with the pliers, but also having this motor skill combination too, where for me, the body's working out how to use it in a movement as well. So you're developing the physical quality, plus you're also developing a movement competency as well. And if you're quite specific around your plyometrics or your ballistic movements that you're training, for me that gets a long way down the path of getting more effective transfer as well. And just one more shout out to Danny's book. I'd highly recommend it. Get onto it. There's some really good programs too there that you could literally plug and play that really clearly outline how to combine pliers and ISOs together. So do get onto that and have a look.
Is it free, Danny? It's not.
You can have it for free.
I don't want
else
it.
have to buy it.
I'm paying. If it's good, I'm paying, Danny. I'm sure it's good.
Yeah.
People should be paying for good quality content. That's my stance. So I'm happy to put my hand in my pocket, Danny. I don't want anything for free.
Okay. Thanks, man. It's pretty. I price it pretty low, actually. I think. Yeah. So yeah.
I've stitched myself up there. I should have definitely stitched myself up there. But just as a reminder, anyone that's got any questions, I'll say this between every couple of points that these guys make. Any questions specifically, stick them in the chat, stick them in the Q&A, and direct them wherever you want me to direct them. Matt, coming on to you. Go on, mate. Carry on.
Just one thing on the back of that piece you were talking about there. I think just to allude, although people sort of get bogged down in these structural adaptations that happen. I think Alex included to there's some really cool central adaptations that occur with this type of training in terms of being able to tap into those high threshold motor units that inherently is quite challenging to do with traditional strength training. And obviously the benefits you get to that without the additive effect of DOMs, etc., that come with it. So I think we're talking about global system adaptations here that occur as a result of doing this type of training. like neural efficiency, all of these things that if you have someone who's maybe not the fastest in the world, but we may be able to like improve their rate coding, being able to tap into those high threshold motor units they do possess, which may give them that little bit of greater propulsion momentum in certain exercises they're doing, or ability to accelerate, or ability to like explode to win or lose ball in a sport, in a game situation. And I think it's that there's these really cool adaptations that maybe they get neglected that really do happen that we can't really quantify. Like we will probably in the future when we understand what's happening up here on a practical level, but at the minute they almost like put in a box in the left-hand corner up here, so my right-hand corner, but they're cool. Then these are parts of like specific neuromuscular adaptations to training. It's about the neuro as well, not just the muscular piece. I just wanted to add that piece there.
Perfect. Thanks, mate. Just juggling around. So just got a message to the chat function. Seems to be not working. Might have to be the Q&A box. People can use the Q&A. I'm pretty sure that's working. So yeah, chuck your questions in there. Matt, sticking with you. On the rehab side, I think ISOs, I don't know if this is still the case, but I think traditionally they were on the front end of a rehab and then seem to disappear as things get more dynamic. But obviously the work of you three guys show that should be a thread that runs through that rehab. Is that still the case, that people still see it as the early stage and maybe haven't got towards?
Yeah, I think when we come into the rehab realm with the use of this type of training, I think we challenge things on another level. There's so many different contextual factors that can come into the use of these tools in rehab. I think there's great evidence, and everyone alludes to that bias study in the New England Journal of Sports Medicine, like early loading. It doesn't tell you exactly what type of loading, but early loading can like accelerate return to sport, return to play, however you want to term it. So I think it's huge benefits with early loading. But I think when we talk about like the rehab side, we talk about an injury, and depending on the severity of the injury, we talk about pain. Which when we bring in about pain, like it is the pain piece around like, does the player just feel discomfort? Do they have apprehension to apply force? So I think it's understanding like then what type of isometric we're using in early rehabilitation, first of all, because we've got this whole spectrum that's been out there. And I think in your course, you've got a great sort of continuum or rough framework of the different types of isometrics and how to program them. But I think that in the rehab realm is like understanding the specific needs of the individual and the needs of the injury. So early rehab for sure. And I think traditionally that is like, okay, can you do submaximal overcoming isometrics in short ranges of motion? Because we know short ranges of motion are not going to induce like lengthening, etc. Then can we progress the lever arm, etc.? And we know there's greater adaptation at long muscle lengths. But I think then we get into this realm of like, what is the adaptation we want in rehab? What are the structures involved in rehab that we want? Is it specifically the tendon that we're trying to train, or is it the muscle side? Is it the muscle tendon unit interaction? Because they interact, they don't operate in isolation. And then how we then apply them, because as a player goes through that return to sport pathway, return to sport continuum, obviously like they get more confident, their ability to produce force improves. And then we can open it out to actually what do we need? And then I think also then what is the training age of that player? What tools are we going to use? Because if you've got a young academy player relative to a really experienced pro athlete who's got a really high training age, like you're not going to apply the same and get the same adaptations. I think there's a great review with Jared McMahon that talks around like the pain, no gain, like where strain magnitude is the big stimulus for tendon adaptation. And we're dealing with different athletes. So you might have one athlete who is say relatively weak, but has really stiffness is really high, hence why they're really elastic and they get around like an Energizer bunny, but we don't say they're strong. So like, do they need a different type of isometric training to induce the strain, or we're just going to make them stiffer? We know stiffness is great from a performance angle, but the injury risk is much, much greater with making athletes stiffer. And if we're talking about elite sport and we're talking about the game itself, which we see the Premier League, the demands are going up. We see the NBA, the demands are coming up. The surfaces are getting harder. the time interaction. Like the sport is probably inducing stiffness changes in these athletes. So then it's like, where are they at? So I think it's understanding the athlete, and then these vast array of tools, the injury context, the training age of the player, and then what is appropriate all the way through and beyond return to sport, because training, the tissue continues to remodel and to adapt after they go back in. So we don't just stop what we're doing in terms of our rehabilitation training prescription, even though they've returned to sport. We continue to support that athlete with ongoing, because that's part of obviously supporting that athlete after injury.
I'll get Danny's take on this because you started talking about stiffness, Danny. But Matt, how do we get that back? So come back to you, Matt. How do we get that balance between obviously the positive stiffness?
The real challenge in practice is obviously we've got percentage M by IC or percentage RM as a way of understanding like the strain magnitude we're placing and the adaptations we want. Like if it's a really high yielding isometric, high cyclic strain, 3 to 5 seconds. And then we want to repeat that. So we're doing it as like a cluster format to improve like tendon strain, because we improve tendon stiffness, reduce strain on the aponeurosis, so that you increase in strain capacity in essence. But then not everyone is the same. And that is the real challenge. There's obviously the research by Rambasas and Bohm, their work has shown maximal isometric contraction. It's done in patella tendon, and then they're looking at an ultrasound to look at the tendon strain at the specific maximal isometric contraction. In practice, day to day, probably not really easy to do right now. But I think as technology evolves and as measurements in the real world improve, we'll be able to really understand what is the relevant tendons, the strain that's needed to induce adaptation. I think for patella and Achilles, it's around 4.5 to 6.5% strain to include adaptation. But is that the same for hamstring tendon? Which hamstring tendon? What part of the tendon? Is it the central tendon, this intramuscular tendon where we're seeing more intramuscular tendon injuries? What type of isometrics cause adaptation to the central tendon rather than the free tendon, which is a lot stiffer? So I think we understand that tendon structure is not all the same as well. So I think, yeah, it's complicated, and I think there's more knowledge, there's more people doing research in this area, and it's incredibly intriguing, I think, in terms of like what's appropriate with what type of injury, what type of player to induce the adaptations that we want over time. Because tendon, as well, we know it has a poor blood supply, which means it takes longer to heal and remodel.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. Alex, just getting you back in. I know Matt mentioned how individual this topic in terms of return to play using ISOs. What's your overall philosophy?
Overall philosophy in a quick snapshot is to use it all the way through and then through into performance. Obviously, that's I say that it is a tool that we should be using into performance, and if they're one and the same for me. Healing from an injury and coming back, it's all related somewhere on that continuum. So from early onset, I think Keith Barr's got a great one with Leicester Tigers. The Argentinian hooker there, use of it very, very early, some PIMA work in long muscle lengths and so on. And for me, I think, again, just to be really succinct, there's this challenge later stage rehab where you're having significant competing demands, load to get them back to play and to be able to be able to tolerate training loads and competition loads and multiple competitions per day and so on. So there's actually competing demands towards the end of stage rehab. And that's probably a really good time then, maybe after a very, very big, dense block of strengthening, to back off of some of the traditional strength training and use your isometrics then as well. So actually emphasize that a bit more while there's competing demands into the competition. And then that early stage, they're in competing again and high competition demands, just throwing more and more at them. When competition goes from the highest you can possibly get to rehab to then comp and then repeating comp is another risky phase as well. So for me, a little bit ludicrous to just only use isometrics early stage, but actually to keep them all the way through and emphasize them even more at end stage and then into performance early.
Love it, mate. Thank you. Danny, anything to add on the stiffness comments that Matt made? No problem if not.
Yeah. So there was I read somewhere before they mentioned about how much, like what Matt said, how much contraction, how much force required to actually cause that adaptation really depends on individual to begin with. So let's say my tendon stiffness is low, then the amount of voluntary contraction I require maybe might just be 60% of voluntary contraction I can induce that tendon adaptation because I'm from a low baseline. But if I'm someone who already has high tendon stiffness, it might take up to 80% of my max voluntary contraction before I can see cause any stimulus to improve that tendon stiffness further. So I personally have no idea how to do the measurement. I don't have the tool at where I am right now. From what research shows, they actually need to do an ultrasound to scan the tendon and look at how much force is required to actually cause elongation and stuff like that in order to measure the tendon stiffness. But in general, I just go ahead with usual training and mix with the plyometric training just to make sure that there's always a balance of muscle stiffness and tendon stiffness. Right? We don't want to get someone to be overtraining on the plyometric. We don't want to get someone to be overtraining on the isometric and stuff like that. Yeah. So training always has to be balanced. Plan it properly, not to overuse any training modalities. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, mate. Right, coming back to
Well, just one.
Oh, go, mate.
Just want to
Yes,
reinforce that word, Bob, from Danny there, because I think it's a great one. Balance training. I think it's huge with any athlete. Like, we're talking about isometrics here, but it's balance training, like time and place for the athlete, what's appropriate. So I think that term there needs to be really emphasized to people about balance training.
Thanks, mate. And I'm getting excited because a few questions are coming in, so definitely keep them coming. Just make sure you direct them at someone so I know to put it to that person. Right, Alex, from the course, and you might say I'm wrong here, but a few of the things that often get the questions are around ARSIST. What are ARSIST assessments and how do you use them to program the different type of exercises? RDR, and what does a session actually look like? Now, we've got 29 minutes, so you could probably take 2 hours and 29 minutes on that, but you've got 3 minutes. So would you mind just kind of packaging that up? Assessments, what is RDR? What does a session look like?
Yeah, no problem, Rob. I will stick to the 3 minutes. I've just wasted 5 seconds.
I'm only joking.
Okay, so run specific isometrics assessments are simply assessments that bias either the ankle, the knee, or the hip in positions similar to mid-stance running positions. So when I say positions, angles specifically, angles at the hip, the knee, and the ankle. The ankle itself is a straight knee one adapted over time, which is to try and isolate the ankle a little bit more. They don't isolate anything. They bias particular musculature around the joints, essentially. There's 2 different types of assessments, a rapid force and a max force assessment. Every time I try and fool myself thinking I can do the one, a cohort of athletes will bite me on the bum and just show me that they are 2 very different assessments. So we use two metrics, maximum force for the max force one, normally a relative score, and we use force at time points for the rapid force assessment. Most common being force at 100 milliseconds. And we do that with a stable pre-tension line, if you like, on the force plates. So that's, in a nutshell, the run-specific isometric assessments. They weren't originally assessments. They were training protocols, and they've become assessments through demand, through people wanting to assess these sort of things and understand how they contribute from a rehab planning perspective, but also from a loading perspective. So that's how we quantify our loadings for our yielding, our switching, quasi-isometrics, and so on with the run-specific isometric strength training. If that's enough on that one, I can move on to RDR.
Perfect.
RDR for me is, cool. RDR for me is one of the most important variables there is, because it's the one that you can get wrong and you'll quickly do a Google search on isometrics and find every Tom, Dick, and Harry commenting about how stressful they are for the nervous system, and it's because they get this factor wrong. Repetition duration is simply the prescribed rep duration, so 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, or whatever, as a percentage of what would be a maximal duration for that intensity. So you can go for 100% pushing, overcoming isometric. It'll last you around 10 seconds, standard deviations of 1.5 seconds either side or so, right? But that's 10 seconds, and then you start to fatigue by 5%. If you used 3-second efforts, that would occupy 30% of what would be a maximal. So that would be called a 30% RDR. If you start using RDRs, 50% and above, even with yielding isometrics, so yielding, holding an 80% load, and I say an 80% load not relative to a concentric lift, but 80% load relative to the pushing isometric muscle action, so the overcoming. If you take that as a load and convert that to a kilogram, if you did that, 80%, you'd last for about 40 seconds before you started fatiguing, and the holding or yielding isometric, you'd be shaking and you'd slowly be becoming eccentric. If you use 10 seconds for a holding time, that would be 25% of that RDR at 80%. So in a nutshell, record, rewind, listen to that again. Hopefully that makes sense for the listeners. And the last one, Rob, was how to put them into programs. Multiple ways, really, and it depends on what you've got in front of you. And we've talked about that a few times, the individual in front of you and how you prescribe them. Some really easy ones to consider are when isometrics or run specific isometrics is a key lift. So that's your main one. You warm up and you go, boom, that's the number one key lift, or 2 or 3 lifts are the key lifts in terms of ankle, knee, and hip. You would normally be specific around that, where based on normative data, and say, okay, well, knee iso push is weak. This is going to be our key lift of the day. That doesn't mean you wouldn't warm up with squats or Olympic lifts or plyos. In fact, I'd recommend doing that to get the best performance outcomes from your key lift as an isometric assessment, isometric lift. You can use an accessory as an accessory lift, which is super common. That's the easiest entry in, where you have them as just accessory lifts towards the end of your training program. Highly effective there too, by the way, highly effective there. And you can also, like we've discussed already, use them as complexes with plyometric or more ballistic type activities. And you can do that as a continuum. You can start off accessories, then they become key lifts, and they become complex lifts as you work through a whole periodized plan. And obviously the biggest thing is, once you look at your data and you collect your data, understanding where versus normative values the weaknesses are. Is it rapid force in the ankle that's the weakest? Then that's got to be your target. And you do different types of training, which you can look at in the course and everything else out there to find out how to try and train specifically for rapid force changes at the ankle. Likewise, if your hip maximal force on your left leg is the weak point, well, then that's where your focus lies, and you start biasing a lot of your training around that. Equally, a very easy way to conceptualize it is, if someone's pretty proficient in their traditional lifts, they're squatting, 1.7 times body weight, and you're flogging to death a dead horse every year, and they get to 1.75 times body weight. That might be the time where you might think, actually, I can keep my squat in, but I might do it on a different day, or it might be a lesser prioritized lift, because the hip iso push is only 1.5 system weights output. So you then start changing your program based around what's in front of you and what you're seeing with your athletes.
Amazing.
About 4.5 minutes, I reckon.
Yeah, good man.
Do we time it by the? Do we time it?
I've got it here. Don't you bloody worry. I've got it on the clock. Matt, go on, mate.
No, I'm just going to allude to the fact that in terms of like quality of the ice, like when we look at like the outputs, like you say, it's relative to body weight, and on any specific test, whether it's isometric, it's just when we look behind it, like the quality of that force time curve, because it's really commonplace now for people to report a output in a Tableau dashboard that looks really cool to people in meetings, that we can say this, but when we delve behind the hood of that output, what's the quality of that force time curve actually look like, especially if we're reporting those like forces at specific time points, like 100 milliseconds, 150, 200. Because if the force time curve isn't good, I'm putting it straight in the bin. Got no confidence in the data. So I think.
What do you mean? Sorry to jump in, Matt. What do you mean by
isometric force time? You've got this period where you've got this pre-tension in, flat line, and then you're going up and you're hitting, sustaining, whether it's a 3 or 5 second, and you're really seeing this really high peak, sustainability of the contraction, nice, smooth force time curve before you drop off. That's what we want to see from a really good whatever type of isometric contraction is, whatever exercise you're doing, whether it's a 90-90, whatever it may be. That's what we want to see, quality of what we do. And that's efficiency of an application of force in a test. Because then when we know, when we do it again, we're actually comparing something that we can see change over time. Or are we just seeing improved familiarization with a test? They're two different things. Because I know if I want to be reporting something about a high level athlete, I need to be on it. I need to be reporting quality data. Dashboards are great, but the data is not very good. I'm sorry, it doesn't mean anything to me. So I think it's the data hygiene piece there that sits before a number's displayed in an output in a spreadsheet, however you do it. Like, go back to the basic principles of what does a good isometric force time curve look like for any practitioner.
A good point, a really good point there too, and not just the force trace. Go and look at the data. So just run it, see how stable that pre-tension period is, how much it's deviating, and then see what happens directly as they start applying force. Is there a little counter movement? Those sort of things are so crucial. So definitely dive into the data as well for sure.
You mentioned one common error there, Alex, about the little counter movement. Is there any other things that people may pick up on if they do dive into the data and are seeing certain things? Any common errors?
If it's a sorry, Alex.
Go on, mate, carry on.
If you're doing anything where you've got like compressive load, it's commonplace to put a pad there. And like sometimes you can see movement in that force time trace. You're getting almost like up and down rather than stabilization. So using something that's going to be obviously support the athlete if they feel more comfortable doing the test with support there, but maybe having something that's like Kevlar or firmer that's not going to give energy leak really.
Anything to add, Alex? Any common errors?
Yeah, you'll see this depending on your racking system too. You can punch the bar into the rack, and that'll show a big spike early, and that'll throw your data out completely. The pre-tension should remove that, but again, it depends on your racking system. So if you look at this a huge spike in the trace, but especially with your numbers, you can eradicate those completely. Just get rid of that data straight away.
Perfect. Right, let's move it on.
They're probably the main ones, mate.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Alex. Got plenty of questions coming in, which is great. So let's move it on. So coming to you, Danny, going back to probably the first couple of minutes, and you spoke about creating isometric exercises that train specific positions found in sport. Would you just give us a bit of almost like a run through of how someone may go about the process of doing that for their particular sport, whatever it may be?
Okay, so recently I spoke with a sprint coach. What they did was they actually got he actually got the athlete to get into a block start position, and he'll position he'll get into block start position, and then the athlete will be holding on to rigid straps behind, and he'll put them into the initial push-off angle, and then into a more extended position. So then that helps him to train at a different range of movement, right? So that is one being for the specific for block start. And the best example would be Alex sprint specific isometric training. He literally get people to be in the position whereby highest amount of force is required during a sprint. So yeah, those are examples of sprint specific position for sprint athletes. And I used to do literally just doing the isometric mid-thigh pull position for my judo athletes, because they tend to have to hold down opponents in that kind of position. So, and we can do like overhead throw position, just attaching to a strap, and then just pull. So that works for an overhead throw action. So usually what I would recommend is to actually position themselves in let's say they are only going to use one position, then I would recommend the athletes to position themselves in where the concentric phase of the action takes place. Right. So again, back to the throw. So for example, the throw concentric phase initiates from this position, and then I'll get them to do the ISO in this position. Right. Because in a stretch position, when you train at the stretch position, you actually get a greater strength improvement through a greater range of movement. So for example, I go back to the knee extension again. So if I get my knee into a 90-degree position whereby my quadricep is stretched versus a position where it's shortened, which is like a 150-degree knee angle position. Training at 150-degree knee angle, I might be able to increase strength through plus minus 15 degree. But if I work at 90-degree knee angle, because it's a more stretched position where my muscle is lengthened, my strength gain might be increased through a greater range, say 30, 40 degree. This is just arbitrary number, but based on research, this is what happens. You get strength gain through a greater range when you're in a stretch position. But of course, if you have to be specific, if your objective is specifically at a certain position, like what Alex does with the sprint specific, then yes, you go with that specific position. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Danny. Matt, anything from a rehab perspective on this topic, getting specific in terms of the joint angles used?
Yeah, I think, like you say, a lot. Generally, probably the tendency is everything very like sagittal plane dominant as well. I think like when we work in like team sports, everything, a lot of movements frontal plane as well. So I think maybe alluding to some time in like in the NBA, like ankle ligament injuries are a big thing, right? In the NBA, and like trying to just stressing the ankle in one position, but actually can you maybe like it's shoulder with a med ball against the wall and pushing laterally, and wherever that's in a degree of like you're in plantar flexion, where you're in dorsiflex position, where you're everting the ankle, you can actually train this joint in these positions, because we know if it's an overcoming type, the athlete can self-manage the amount of force they're then applying and get more comfortable over time. So we can actually play around with different positions. We can challenge range of motion, whether that's further dorsiflexion, whether that's greater plantar flexion, where it's coming up almost like where you're pushing out laterally. Like, I mean, that's the beauty of this. Like you're finding a position, and then you're teaching an athlete to apply force in that position. So I think, yeah, like, and we see like these type of injuries, it's being adaptable as well, because not every athlete wants to push into an immovable bar as well. So I think, and when you're dealing with someone who's maybe 7'3", do we want to be doing that as well? That's another question. We have to be adaptable. We have to find tools. We have to use these principles. There's some great knowledge that these two dudes have shared. They're out there, and we just have to use that and apply it. Doesn't have to be a barbell. Could be anything. You could be using a Kaiser squat to do a yielding isometric hold, because you're in this position. You can ramp the load up, and they're really cool. Whereas, especially in a player who's got unique demographics. So I think in the rehab, it would like force people to be creative. That's the real thing here. Be creative, but don't forget the underlying principles below that you apply when you do be creative. And then consistency with something. If you want to cause change, you have to be consistent and compliant with a program.
Thanks, Matt. Right, I'm going to stick with you. So we're going to have we'll come on to a few misconceptions at the end. So I'm going to dive into the questions because we've got 12 minutes left, and I promised would stick to time as close as we possibly could. So question for Matt, but from Tom. How do you implement ISOs in team environment with so many athletes to handle in such short time frames? So pre-training, post-training.
Are we talking what team sport?
Let's go football because it's yours.
Okay,
currently
football. Yeah, I suppose the one with football is like it generally, like, staffing numbers is great. The more staff you have in and around athletes, the better, because you can stop the tomfoolery of them messing around and the matching quality. So like staffing ratios is probably critical. But I think it's if it's obviously pre-training, you're probably not going to apply like high strain yielding type isometrics pre-training. You're probably not going to do it, just because that relationship between that eccentric phase and stuff. You're probably not going to do it pre-training. So I think like it's knowing that what do you want to gain from what you apply. Like pre-training could be some of the paired complexes that Danny's talked about in terms of key movements. Okay, what's the type of training that we've worked with the coach to understand what the type of training session is. Then there's how that, like, if it's an acceleration position, are we working on acceleration, or if it's deceleration, how are we going to link those positions to the type of training we want to apply, knowing the periodization structure of the week, or whether it's the mesocycle. So I think it's working back from that. Like, I'm not going to give you a straightforward answer of like what I would do when I would do it, because I don't know, because I don't know the athlete you're dealing with, the caliber of the athlete, the facility you have, the tools you have. Like that's the unique makeup of being the practitioner in that position, is understanding what you're going to do. But I think it's if you think about the bigger picture and you look at what you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it, and the time frame you're in, proximity to competition, how many competitions, that will give you a good idea of how you would program it with players in a team sport environment.
Thanks, Matt. Alex, just tapping into a previous life of yours in a team environment, how would you use ISOs in them short periods of time, the little pockets that you get in team sports?
Yeah, look, really simple, to be honest. If we just forget about yielding for now, just chuck that to the side, because that requires weights being moved or whatever. So if you want to have real simplicity, set up 3 bars. Set up 3 bars, short people, medium people, tall people. You're going to be roughly, you're not doing a scientific experiment here. You're just going to get roughly, if you want 90-degree squat, that's where you're doing your pushing isometric. You have 3 of them set up, use a complex. You know, they might go from upper body exercise to that. And then the next complex might be another upper body, or it might be a hamstring exercise, again, back to it, or whatever it is. And you just cycle guys through there. You know, easily get 3 set up bars, and get 20 guys coming through the gym, and be able to get, multiple doses of 3-second or 5-second efforts. And remember, it's ISOs. They get straight in, they'll go hard for 5 seconds. If you're lucky enough to have force plates in each one, happy days, they can see their output, and then they're off. And then they're off doing another exercise. Or they do, if you're like Danny, do 3 or 4 multiple reps, they do that as well. They're on and off much faster than you can if you're sharing a squat with 1 or 2 other athletes. So it's actually really easy to implement if you're doing pushing isometric muscle actions. But again, like Danny mentioned before, a lot of people now using doses, microdosing through the week. So again, depending on how the systems run, whether they come in, they have their physio checks, they have their checks with their coach, they come and do their counter movement jumps, they can go do their ISOs, they can move through sequences easy enough. So just be a bit creative. I think Matt's mentioned being creative a number of times this morning. Be creative how you do it, set multiple stations up, make the athletes accountable, and then execute. It's actually not that hard if you stick to pushing isometrics.
Just a quick one, Rob, if that's all right, with what Alex alluded to there around counter movement jump testing in and around when you're doing overcoming isometrics. If you're looking at like monitoring and using them as a monitoring tool, wherever you're going to categorize fatigue with that's to be alluded to. But if you're going to do overcoming isometrics prior to a player then doing counter movement jumping, you're probably going to see a difference without the overcoming isometric before. So just be aware that just if you're going to look at changes over time, just make sure that you continually stick to those same procedures of overcoming ISO before the counter movement jump, because you are going to see differences in your outputs there for sure.
Jump in, Danny.
Yep, just a quick one. Yeah, so you can actually get athletes to do isometric training with microdosing almost every training session, whether it's field training or what's it called, in the weights room. athletes tend to do static stretches. So instead of telling them, instead of holding that, just stretching, do an isometric contraction in that stretch position, and that works wonders. Especially if we are looking at the hamstring stretch, whereby you have the partner pushing on you and then you're stretching your hamstring, you can actually push against your partner, and that helps with both your flexibility and your strength as well.
Thanks, Danny. The question that's just come in, I want to attack it because I know Alex has got a solution for this. I think it'll be a very common one. No access to a gym, limited equipment on the field, but listen to this for the last 53 minutes and thinking this is for me. Alex, what can people do there?
Yeah, look, I am full disclosure. I'm in partnership with a strap, a company that actually does a strap, 0RM. They're called the Isometrics strap. I just think it's a great product, real, well priced as well, and it's got multiple attachments or anchoring points, if you like, that you can do grip work. You can put your foot in, and it's nice and comfortable, thick, so it doesn't dig into your skin. Nice material, very versatile. Wraps up into a ball like this, and you got this strap that you can use with 6'3" guys all the way down to the little men, and you can do multiple exercises. So do look at 0RM. Look at my Instagram. I've got a couple little things on there, helping them develop their course as well, so you can get a full rundown on how to use a strap. So on the field with your female football club, if that's what it is, you can do your pushing isometric muscle actions pretty simply with them and a whole range of different exercises.
Lovely. Sticking with you, Alex, another one. And I get other people's, get specifically Danny's because he's talked about this. Joint angles so important for force expression data capture. How confident are you with the quality of our current toolkits to maintain joint angles and data quality we're after?
Hour, and I don't know about hour.
The industry hour.
Okay, yeah. Look, I'd probably be as confident as I am with IMTP and ISO squat. I think you only have to look on Instagram and see some isometric mid-thigh pulls where you have to look really hard to see if there's any knee flexion at all there, right? Like, fully extended and so on. So like any assessment, how good is the quality of the data we were talking about before? How good is the protocols used? Are people painstakingly going and measuring joint angles? Are people measuring joint angles at the right time? Are they doing it sub-maximal and not at 90% or 100%? Are people brave enough to get rid of that data because they've just done a knee iso push of 5 times body weight, which only the real strength power athletes do at those right joint angles. And little Johnny, the soccer player or badminton player, no offense, is punching out those sort of scores. Well, you can guarantee that he's at a knee angle of 170 probably, and not 135 to 145 like it should be. So I can't guarantee that. Absolutely not. Vold will be releasing the normative data on this after probably another year or so of collection, and they have a really scrutinized the data. Any anomaly is just canned out. It goes through a whole phase eventually until it's up with the experts that know these assessments really well, who will then put another cast of eyes through it to go, that's ridiculous. That's impossible with a ballerina. That's impossible. That is right. And so by the end, when you have your normative data, it's going to be pretty scrutinized. And dare I say, Matt might not like this, and nor might Danny, my fellow PhDs, but probably better than some of the like some research out there with 20 athletes or 30, college-age kids. At least you're going to have some good data in terms of what's good or what's not for your particular cohorts. But yeah, look, all I can say is I'm not confident. No, I'm pretty confident the staff around me, and when I witness and I share protocols, I am. Even the workshops I run, right in front of me after, explaining in depth and showing how it can be done incorrectly right in front of me. So that's science. That's the applied world, and that's what we have to be critical of and understand that things can still be done pretty poorly out there. But equally, so is the isometric squat and the isometric mid-thigh pull.
Perfect, thanks, mate. Right, the hope is be a relatively quick one. Danny, how would you identify which athlete has sufficient tendon stiffness and which requires greater tendon stiffness?
Honestly, I don't. Yeah, like I said, I don't have the equipment to actually do it. What I really do is I look at their overall performance on the jump. I look at the performance with the hops, and from there I try to determine. And then I look at dynamic strength. From there I try to determine whether it's the lack of plyometric training, or was it the lack of strength training that they require. So if it's it seems like they don't have that ability to be really explosive, the movement doesn't seem really fast, I would say that they probably aren't able to contract the muscle quickly, right? And we can look at the explosive strength, rate of force development, or what Alex would use, the force at 100 milliseconds. That is a good indicator of how fast the muscle can actually contract, right? So if that the athlete doesn't have that high early force development, I would think that they can't actually stiffen the muscle, they can't actually contract the muscle fast enough. So that will require a lot more ballistic activity, right? And then from there, I'll try to balance out. I'll always have isometric training for them. I'll always have plyometric training for them. It's just from time to time, I'll have to look at their physical performance measured through using force plates to determine. And I would say I won't always be right, because like I said, I don't have the exact equipment to measure it. But I think when you have done coaching for many years, you tend to have that intuition in you to determine whether this athlete is at this stage or at that stage. Something I don't think any of us can teach. It comes with years of observation and experience.
Perfect.
Sorry,
Thanks,
I can't give a good answer for that.
It's a good answer. No, thanks, Danny. Matt, jump in.
Just one thing I was going to say, something that might give you a bit of a proxy of as a proxy indicator of stiffness might be in terms of if you're doing a jump test on a force plates is looking at their rate of loading in the downward phase, so eccentric peak velocity against their displacement, so counter movement depth. Like if they've got a shallow depth and they can load at a rapid velocity, that's probably giving you an indicator that this athlete has some really good stiffness capabilities. Whereas this is an athlete who is relatively fast, but goes all the way down to get all their strength quality to get all the way back up. That's probably giving you an idea that they probably don't have the level of the stiffness, just in a more dynamic assessment rather than an isometric assessment.
Sticking with you, Matt, we're 1 minute over, and I want to stick to as much as we can. But one last thing, because I think this will be relevant to a lot of people who've joined us or will join us in the future. If people don't have force plates, any tools that can get some of the way there for people?
Well, obviously, there's other than the force plate. Force plate is actually quite affordable now. If you're going back to a Pasco plate, it's not particularly dear. Like I've got some sitting here in the corner here that I still use from like 10 years ago. Like Pasco is probably less than £1,000 now, I'm assuming, just to buy and then use, and you just need software to actually look at it. You don't want to be putting all that force time data into an Excel spreadsheet back in the day like PGS used to do. But yeah, you've got strain gauges. You've obviously got handheld dyno where you're assessing an isometric contraction. It's probably more of an isolated joint position that you might be using more traditionally used in a rehabilitation setting. And obviously then you've got like the reliability of those if you've got a different assessor holding it and all those things. But they will give you a nice idea of isometric force production in a specific test that you're doing. Probably not going to be great for doing any of the full system ones, like a run specific one using a dyno, but obviously you can assess isometric function, muscle function using dynamometers, strain gauges, etc.
Love it. Thanks, Matt. There's one about RDR, wanting more information on RDR. It probably could be all day on that. So I hate when people do this, but there's loads of information in the course that Alex did, but both Matt and Danny contributed to. So anything to add there, Alex?
Yeah, look, I can do really, really quickly for anonymous attendee.
Yep.
You visualize RDR as visualize RDR as reps in the tank with traditional strength training. Simple as that. So if you want to leave more reps in the tank, essentially, although you'll be working maximally, you leave more reps in the tank, they have more energy, they have more, recover quicker and so on. So work at 30%, lots left in the tank. Work at 70%, not a lot left in the tank. You can't do as much volume. Plus there will be some consequences with nervous system fatigue, for example, off the back of it. So just picture it as reps in reserve as traditional strength training.
Love it. Thanks, mate. Have you got anything to add, Matt, or are we just unmuting?
Sorry.
That's fine. No problem. All good. Right. I'm 3 minutes over. Apologies. Alex, hope you have a good evening. Danny, same. Matt, have a good rest of the day. And thank you for joining me. Really appreciate you lining it up. And look forward to keeping in touch and seeing you all soon.